In the late 1960s, the world of music was going through a magical time, and nowhere was this spirit more alive than in Laurel Canyon, a quiet neighborhood in the hills of Los Angeles. Here, creativity filled the air, and the streets echoed with the voices of young artists who would soon become legends. Imagine the warm California sun setting over wooden houses hidden in the hills, while music drifted out from open windows. Among these dreamers were Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, two Canadian musicians who had left their homes in search of something bigger. Both had an unshakable belief in their talent, and both would soon rise to the very top of folk and rock music. To many, they seemed like natural allies, two brilliant minds shaped by the same country, the same generation, and the same hunger for artistic freedom. Yet, as often happens in the world of genius, harmony was only on the surface. Behind the polite smiles and mutual admiration, there were differences that slowly turned into tension. Neil Young was unpredictable, raw, and fiery, while Joni Mitchell carried herself with an icy calm, sharp wit, and a need for control. In those early days, fans might have thought they belonged to the same circle, but even then, small cracks had begun to form in their connection. Although Neil Young and Joni Mitchell respected each other's art, their personalities often collided in subtle but meaningful ways. Joni, who had already begun to build her reputation as a songwriter with unmatched poetic depth, sometimes saw Neil as reckless, impatient, and unwilling to polish his craft. Neil, on the other hand, thought Joni was too concerned with her image and too cold in her dealings with others. The truth is, both were strong, independent, and stubborn, which meant that any partnership between them was bound to come under strain. Stories began to spread within the music community about small disagreements at parties, or moments when Joni would quietly dismiss Neil's music in private conversations. At first, these tensions were brushed aside as normal artistic differences. However, in the early 1990s, a collaboration between them went terribly wrong, and what might have been just small disagreements turned into something much more serious. According to those who knew them, Joni did not confront Neil with anger or public fights. Instead, she chose a different path, a slow and deliberate silence. She began refusing to appear at shows where Neil was present, turned down joint events, and even dismissed his work and clipped cold words during interviews. To Neil, this felt like more than a disagreement. It felt like a quiet exile, a decision by Joni to erase him from her artistic memory. For Neil Young, who was used to dealing with life through sudden bursts of emotion, Joni's cold silence was far more painful than an open argument. To him, it felt like being erased without warning. She didn't yell, she didn't fight. She simply vanished from his life and refused to acknowledge his presence. Festival organizers were often puzzled when she declined invitations that included Neil. Industry insiders noticed when she turned away from him at events or left rooms without saying a word. It was as if she had made a decision to cut every thread that had once connected them. Neil, who could often be fiery and outspoken, chose instead to remain quiet. For years he carried the wound privately, refusing to speak about the way Joni had treated him. But the pain did not disappear. It stayed with him, growing colder with time until finally he decided to speak out. When Neil finally revealed his side of the story, fans were shocked. To them, Joni had always been the queen of poetic beauty, the fragile artist whose songs spoke of love and longing. But Neil's words revealed another side of her, a side that was sharp, deliberate, and capable of emotional revenge that could cut deeper than any public fight. What hurt Neil most was not rage, but the glacial silence that left him feeling as though he no longer existed in her world. Neil Young was not the only one who had seen the cold side of Joni Mitchell. Her romantic history was filled with both passion and heartbreak, and many of the men who had loved her ended up walking away wounded. Graham Nash, who once adored her deeply and even got engaged to her, was left heartbroken when Joni ended their relationship suddenly, leaving only a note behind. Jackson Browne, another famous musician, found himself painted in a negative light in her songs after their split. Even Leonard Cohen, who shared a brief but powerful connection with her, reportedly said that Joni wanted to love but not be loved in return. James Taylor, during one of the darkest times in his life, turned to her for comfort. But their relationship ended as soon as his struggles began to weigh too heavily. There were others too, actors, musicians, and writers, who described similar experiences. For Joni, love seemed to be a way of feeding her art, but once it no longer inspired her, she would leave. Her partners often described her as brilliant but emotionally distant, capable of creating masterpieces in her music while remaining difficult to connect with in everyday life. This pattern of passion and withdrawal became one of the central themes of her personal story. Beyond her romantic life, Joni Mitchell also had a reputation for being sharp-tongued and brutally honest with her peers. She clashed with Bob Dylan, once calling him a fake and accusing him of stealing his entire style. Even though they had shared stages in the past, she often dismissed him in later years as nothing more than a copy of others. She criticized Madonna, saying she was lowering the standards of art, and dismissed Beyoncé as a product rather than a true creator. Lady Gaga, too, was brushed aside by Joni, who said she was all performance and no soul. These weren't just quiet opinions shared among friends. They were sharp public statements that often made headlines. Even her friendship with Joan Baez, once a strong bond in the folk music world, fell apart after heated arguments about authenticity and ambition. Joni also had conflicts with institutions like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which she once called a boys' club circus. To many, these statements showed her courage to speak her mind, but to others, they painted a picture of a woman who burned bridges as quickly as she built them. For Neil, who had watched these patterns unfold for decades, her treatment of him was not an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of coldness and conflict. Behind Joni Mitchell's sharp edges and complicated relationships was a deep wound that shaped much of her life. In 1965, before she became famous, she gave birth to a daughter. Struggling financially and abandoned by the father of the child, she felt she had no choice but to give the baby up for adoption. This decision haunted her for decades and influenced many of her songs. In her haunting track Little Green, she wrote about the child she could not keep, though fans at the time did not realize the true meaning behind the lyrics. For years, Joni kept this secret hidden, not even telling close friends or collaborators. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the truth became public, and Joni was reunited with her daughter, Lauren Gibb. At first, their reunion was celebrated as a heartwarming story of healing. However, the reality was far more difficult. Their relationship quickly became strained, as Joni found it hard to bridge the emotional distance of decades. Arguments and silences replaced the joyful image the media had painted, and soon they drifted apart again. For Joni, this personal loss was something she carried her whole life, and it often appeared in her music as a quiet but powerful sadness. When Neil Young finally spoke out about his experience with Joni Mitchell, it forced fans to see her in a new light. She was no longer just the beautiful, fragile songwriter whose lyrics could move people to tears. Instead, she appeared as a complicated woman, filled with both genius and scars. Her sharp criticisms, her broken relationships, and her cold silences all seemed to come from a place of deep pain and self-protection. To some, this made her even more fascinating, a true artist who lived without compromise. To others, it showed a side of her that was harsh, unyielding, and difficult to admire. Neil's account of her calculated silence painted her as someone who used distance as a weapon, a way of hurting without speaking a word. Yet, even in her coldest actions, there was brilliance. She transformed pain into poetry, heartbreak into songs, and anger into art. That duality of beauty and cruelty, of openness and coldness, became the very essence of her legend. Today, Joni Mitchell remains one of the most important and influential musicians in history. Her songs have inspired generations, and her impact on folk, rock, and pop music is undeniable. But thanks to Neil Young's revelations and the stories that have surrounded her life, her image is no longer just one of a gentle, fragile songwriter. Instead, she is remembered as a woman of contradictions. Brilliant but difficult, poetic but sharp, vulnerable yet armored. Neil's story about her cold silence shocked fans because it revealed the human flaws behind the myth. Yet perhaps that is what makes Joni Mitchell's story so powerful. She was not perfect, and she never tried to be. She lived her life on her own terms, even if it meant breaking hearts, burning bridges, and walking away from those who once loved her. In the end, her legacy is not just about her music, but about the way she lived. Fearless, flawed, and unforgettable. Neil Young and Joni Mitchell were more than just two artists from the same country. In many ways, they were reflections of each other, though distorted. Neil was often described as raw, emotional, and almost reckless in his creative choices. He could walk into a studio and record a song in one take, imperfections and all, and then release it to the world without hesitation. To him, honesty was more important than polish. Joni, however, was the opposite. Her songs were carefully crafted, her lyrics poetic and layered with hidden meanings, and her delivery controlled and precise. Where Neil would roar with feedback and unpolished chords, Joni would glide with unusual tunings and delicate arrangements. Fans often wondered why two artists so different could not find common ground. Some believed their differences were what made their early connection exciting, while others thought these same differences made a long-term friendship impossible. As time went on, their approaches to music became symbolic of their personalities. Neil, the untamed spirit, and Joni, the calculating poet. Their music mirrored their relationship. Beautiful when parallel, but clashing when paths crossed. To truly understand the tension between Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, one must step back and look at the larger world of Laurel Canyon. In the 1960s and 1970s, this small neighborhood was the beating heart of American folk and rock music. It was a place where the Byrds, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, The Doors, and countless other artists lived, worked, and sometimes loved one another. It was also a place where competition ran deep. Friendships often blurred into rivalries, and creative partnerships sometimes ended in bitterness. In this environment, Joni Mitchell stood out not just as a female artist in a male-dominated industry, but as someone whose talent could not be denied. She was unapologetically independent, and that independence often threatened the fragile egos of those around her. Neil Young, who also thrived on individuality, may have felt that same clash more personally. To many, Laurel Canyon was a paradise of music and love. But underneath the surface, it was also a battlefield where every artist was fighting for recognition, respect, and a place in history. Joni and Neil's conflict was not just about two people. It was a reflection of the canyon itself, where beauty and rivalry lived side by side. When Neil Young finally spoke out about Joni Mitchell's cold silence, fans were stunned. For decades, many had imagined that the folk legends of the 60s and 70s were part of one large, loving family of artists. The truth, however, was far more complicated. Fans who had admired both Neil and Joni suddenly had to face the reality that their heroes were not always kind to one another. In the music industry, these revelations also sparked discussions about how personal relationships between artists could shape careers. For example, when Joni refused joint appearances or collaborations, Neil's opportunities in those spaces were directly affected. Likewise, her dismissive words about his music influenced how critics and other musicians viewed him. It wasn't simply personal drama. It had professional consequences. Industry insiders often whispered about how Joni's sharp opinions could close doors for those she disliked, while her approval could open others. For younger fans discovering these stories today, the conflict between Neil and Joni is a reminder that even the most celebrated legends are human, full of flaws and capable of hurting one another in lasting ways. Joni Mitchell's life shows how genius often comes with a price. For her, the price was emotional distance. Many who knew her said that while her music revealed her deepest vulnerabilities, in real life, she was difficult to reach. This contrast created a kind of armor that protected her from being too exposed, but also pushed people away. Her decision to erase Neil Young from her world is just one example of how she used silence as a tool. For Joni, silence was not just the absence of words, it was power. By refusing to acknowledge someone, she could control the narrative, maintain her independence, and avoid confrontation. However, this power also came at a cost. Over time, it left her isolated, with fewer allies and more stories of broken ties. Her pattern of using art as a way to process pain while avoiding it in her personal life made her a legend in music, but also a mystery in her relationships. To many, this armor is what allowed her to create songs of unmatched beauty, but it also made her one of the most complex and difficult figures in the world of folk and rock. As the years pass, the story of Neil Young and Joni Mitchell becomes less about a single conflict, and more about the legacy of two artists whose lives and careers were intertwined yet divided. Joni will always be remembered for her poetic genius, her groundbreaking albums, and her fearless independence. But thanks to Neil's revelations, she will also be remembered as someone who could be cold, distant, and ruthless in her personal dealings. This duality does not diminish her legacy, it deepens it. Great artists are rarely simple, and Joni Mitchell is perhaps the clearest example of this truth. Neil Young, by finally speaking out, added another layer to her story, one that fans must now wrestle with as they listen to her songs. In the end, Joni's contradictions are what make her unforgettable. She was both muse and critic, healer and wounder, fragile and unyielding. Neil's shock may have opened old wounds, but it also reminded the world that legends are not gods. They are people, flawed, brilliant, and endlessly fascinating.